Hi, I'm Jodi. I want to ask you something. Can housing be more than housing? I grew up in North Carolina during the gay rights movement, and I went to church every Sunday. I learned how wrong it was to be different. Love the person but hate the sin was preached over and over. I felt different from a young age, but I wasn't sure why. This was before the internet, so I couldn't Google it, and trans people just weren't talked about that much. The message was clear, though. Being different is a sin. So it's not an inherent part of who you are. It's something you choose to do, and you can choose to stop and cure yourself. That message would stay with me throughout my life. With the church's help, I could be normal. I wouldn't have been made this way if it was wrong, so it must be something I'm doing. I didn't have a great childhood and moved away as soon as I could. For me, that meant joining the Navy shortly after high school graduation. The Navy opened my eyes to a whole new world. I was exposed to different cultures and different ways of thinking. In San Francisco, I first saw two men walking down the street holding hands. It wasn't gross at all like I'd learned in church. They actually looked happy. In the Navy, I started exploring, thinking maybe I'm gay. Maybe that's the difference I've been feeling. I met a couple of gay ex-sailors that lived in San Diego, and they opened their apartment to me. So we had such great times, good parties, long nights watching movies, and a lot of talks about being gay and what that meant in the world then. It was exciting, scary, and at the same time, I felt like I'd found my tribe for the first time in my life. Being gay didn't fit me too well, but I was able to be myself around them and not worry about being different. After the Navy, I went back to North Carolina for university and got married to a wonderful woman. All the shame of being different rushed back, and I hid inside myself again, just hoping I could be forgiven for all the sins from my Navy years and that I could still be cured. That marriage lasted 7 years, and we really did love each other. I would, on occasion, try cross-dressing when I was alone at home. Then I would throw away all my carefully hidden clothes and swear I would never do it again. I would get the urge again after time had passed, usually a year or more. This was a pattern that repeated until I transitioned. But each time, the time between throwing everything out and buying more clothes became shorter and shorter. We divorced in 1998. We wanted different things in life and grew apart. Looking back now, it's easier to see the role that my gender played in the divorce. In late 1999, I moved to Edmonton. Before I moved, I asked a mechanic friend to install a block heater on my vehicle. He asked me why I would want to move anywhere where I needed that. I couldn't tell him, but I really wanted to get away from the place where I didn't belong. For the next several years, I would fluctuate between cross-dressing and looking for religion to save me. After 7 years in Edmonton, I moved to Pender Island. In such a small and tight-knit community, it was difficult to dress and keep it a secret. In 2009, I ended up in Victoria. I arrived broke and spent my first couple of weeks there living on the streets and in shelters. After moving around a bit more, I went back to Edmonton in 2013 to take care of some business there. As soon as I was back, I went to a lingerie store that I'd shopped at when I lived there before. I was scared to go in the store as usual, so I waited until after dark to go and made sure no other customers were in the store. I went in, headed to a corner of the store furthest from the till so I could be out of sight of everyone. While I was looking, one of the employees came up to me and asked if she could help me. I said I was looking for something for my girlfriend. I said she was about the same size as me. She said, "Is it for you?" I was totally busted, and in my panicked mind, I couldn't think of any way out, so I just nodded, expecting her to kick me out of the store. Instead, she asked me if I wanted to go into the back where it was private, and she would bring items back for me. You can't imagine my relief. Not only was I not getting kicked out, but I'd found someone who wanted to help me. Before I left that night, I exchanged numbers with her. Her name was Red, and we became very good friends. Red would take me shopping with her and her girlfriends on Sundays. We would go to retro dress stores and then out to eat. With her help, I figured out my sizes and bought a couple of outfits. Eventually, I ended up renting a room in her house. I'd never been in such a supportive atmosphere since I started exploring my gender. While I was in Edmonton, I started exploring on the internet what the process of transitioning might look like. After so many years of holding on to religious beliefs that were not necessarily mine, I began accepting that I am a trans woman. In 2014, I moved to Vancouver for the sole reason to transition. I did my research, found a great GP that has helped me every step of the way. I am very privileged to be white, well-educated, and at the time had a decent job. I want to be very clear. While my story shares some commonality with others, every person's transition is unique to them. I've faced barriers and discrimination, and I try not to compare, but I know that my privilege has made my transition easier than many others. When I moved to Vancouver, I lived in a basement suite near Commercial Drive. My landlord lived above me, and I saw him often in the backyard. He had a huge garden with a lot of vegetables. He was always generous and would share them with me. While living there, I began hormone therapy. On Thanksgiving Day in 2016, I began living as my true self full-time. It was nerve-wracking going into the world presenting as female for the first time. In my mind, every person that looked my way knew I was trans and was making fun of me in their head. Of course, now I realize most people are so caught up in their own world, they probably barely gave me a second glance. The one person who noticeably changed their attitude towards me was my landlord. He was not so friendly anymore. No more vegetables, no more smiles or hellos. At best, he would try to avoid looking at me. At worst, he would laugh at me as I walked by. I started trying to avoid leaving when he was outside. It made me nervous that someone who was obviously transphobic had access to my living space. I looked for a way out, but with the difficult rental market, I couldn't leave. I was on disability at the time, and the waiting list for housing assistance was years long. In 2021, my GP let me know that there was a housing project opening specifically for trans, gender diverse, and two-spirit people. She gave me the contact information for the director that was opening the project. I sent an email, explained my situation, and why I would like to live in this housing project. The director got in touch with me shortly after and told me I probably wasn't the best fit to live there. They were prioritizing unhoused people. After explaining about the project, named Aoki Ross House, the director then asked me if I might be interested in working there instead. So I was working as a peer support worker at that time and only working a handful of hours each week. After years of struggles with my mental health, I wasn't sure I was ready for full-time work, but the opportunity to work at Aoki Ross House sounded like an amazing chance, and I went back and forth for a couple of days. I had agreed to an interview, but knew I still had a chance to back out if I wanted to. I was nervous, but the interview went well. The director invited me to come see Aoki Ross House. My first visit to the house was a bit overwhelming. The house itself was built in 1907. It has a long history of housing people and looked to be in great shape for its age. It was originally built by Japanese immigrants to house other Japanese workers. There's rumors that it was a brothel at one time, and later an architect bought it and remodeled it, naming it Ross House, in honor of his son who had died from the poison drug supply. I'd never been inside a single-room occupancy building before, so I got a quick education that day. There are 23 rooms in the house, plus an office. Washrooms and kitchens are all shared. The director explained that this was the first project to exclusively house trans, gender diverse, and two-spirit people in the country. We talked about some of the challenges I might face in the job, and while talking to him, I really saw how rewarding the job could be. I'd been looking for a way to give back, especially to the trans community. Having lived through housing insecurity myself, I could see how important this project could be for the community. This job would combine not only housing individuals, but providing support to them. It was a steep learning curve because the house was slated to open in a couple of weeks, but I accepted the position of program manager of Aoki Ross House. I started on May 17th, 2021. and Aoki Ross House officially opened on June 1st. It felt like I'd just dived off the deep end. There were long hours, a lot of work, learning, and a lot of mistakes made, but I loved the work. It got even better as I settled into the role and built relationships with the residents. They each had their own story, but there was always something, no matter how small, that we could bond over. I heard common stories of housing discrimination, harassment, and assault by staff and other residents in shelters and other housing. People were forced to live in housing or shelters that aligned with their gender assigned at birth, not their true gender. This led to dysphoria and unsafe housing. Many would prefer to live on the streets than face this. Aoki Ross gave the few we were able to house a safe place to be themselves. It didn't happen overnight, but with the work, we have built a community in the house. The residents that want to get and give tips to help each other get through transitioning and life as a transgender, diverse, or two-spirit person. Aoki Ross gave me a job where I didn't have to worry every time I met someone new that they wouldn't accept me as a transgender woman. I feel like I've found my calling here, and it continues to give me the opportunity to advocate for more much-needed housing for the 2S TGD community. I eventually found affordable housing close to work and was able to get out of that basement suite. For the last 3 years, I've felt safe in my housing, and I don't have to worry who's outside my door when I leave my apartment. Trans people are overrepresented in the unhoused or precariously housed population. In the 2023 City of Vancouver homeless count, 3% of the respondents identified as having transgender experience, but less than 1% of BC's total population is transgender. Add to that the hidden homeless, and the likely number of unhoused trans people is much higher. The 2019 TransPulse survey found that 15% of trans people had an income of $15,000 or less, compared to only 9% of the general population. With 23 rooms at Aoki Ross House, we've received over 100 applications. These have come from unhoused, precariously housed, people in unsafe housing, and people who just want to be in a welcoming community. Building community can be a problematic thing for 2S TGD people. Some choose not to and would rather live their lives in stealth and not draw any attention to the fact that they're trans. That's a perfectly valid choice, and I can completely understand it, but not all people have that option. There are a few peer groups in Vancouver, but they do not serve the needs of everyone. Like any group of people in the 2S TGD community, there are people of different ages, different personalities, different outlooks on life, and different values. Not everyone is going to get along and find a good fit in a social group. Community is very important to 2S TGD people, though. One study showed that among unhoused trans people, community with other trans folks was the biggest factor in creating resiliency. For trans people, building community can be the difference between life and death. Being around community is important for everyone. When I was going through troubles in my life, I spent some time in the hospital on psych wards. During my time there, I realized how helpful it was to have peers to talk to. We shared experiences, humor, and tips to make things better. Being around people that may not have the same exact experience, but similar enough to understand mine, was a real comfort. That's why I got into peer support work. So, can housing be more than housing? Housing can provide community for the people who need it. When staff can build relationships with the residents, they can use that to connect residents with each other, holding events that bring the residents together, like parties, a craft day, or anything else that might be enjoyable. Give them a reason to bond. Residents feel safer when they're in community with their neighbors and know they all have a desire to live in a safe space. Knowing each other eliminates a lot of suspicion and misunderstandings. Supporting each other and sharing resources with each other only adds to the support that staff can give. When someone is having a bad day, they're there to pick each other up and help build that resiliency in each other. Many of the buildings do not have proper supports in place for the residents, but we can always leverage the resources we have. One of the greatest resources the building has are the people, staff, and residents. At Aoki Ross, we serve a unique community. Aoki Ross is still the only housing in Western Canada exclusively for the 2S TGD community. It's so important to me to provide a safe space inside the house for people to be their authentic selves. We've come up with creative solutions to some of the unique challenges this community faces. One resident was worried about going to hell and her dead mother not accepting her because she was trans. My solution was to have her talk with a psychic, a solution I knew she would be open to. It worked, and she was assured that she wasn't destined for hell and that her family loves her very much. I think we've improved the lives of our residents, and I'm sure my life has improved since being in community with the staff and residents. We try to provide varied opportunities for everyone to learn and grow. We are underfunded at Aoki Ross House, but still manage to find ways to create a safe and welcoming space. Our community has grown over the 3 years as well. In addition to the 23 residents, we still provide support for some former residents that have moved on. Aoki Ross is not just housing, it's a community. We marched in the Pride Parade together, go to the Queer Film Festival together, and celebrate important events in the 2S TGD calendar together. On the last Monday of every month, Sage Food Share provides the gift of food for Aoki Ross House. This is a morning of gathering on the sidewalk outside Aoki Ross House and socializing. Sage brings food, lays it out on tables, and lets residents shop for what they want, giving them choice. Most residents get their food and stay for a couple of hours of social time with staff and other residents. On many sunny weekends, you can find residents outside drawing with chalk on the sidewalk, blowing bubbles and laughing. Providing ways for the residents to bond with each other has created a wonderful dynamic in the house. Of course, we have problems, but things that would seem so minor in other settings are our big issues. Lateral violence was a huge issue when the house opened. It seems each resident was pitted against each other while they were getting used to the environment. That has largely disappeared now. Some just because they learned who they don't get along with and avoid each other, but I think most got to know each other and found some common ground. Housing doesn't just have to be about a place to live. It can be about learning to live in community despite differences. It can be that safe space you can escape the outside world in. It sounds idealistic, and in reality, it's not all sunshine and rainbows, but there is something magical about it. Thank you.